When I was a kid, we didn't have a lot of TV channels, but one of them had a great kids show called The Hilarious House of Frightenstein. It's sort of a cult classic in Canada. They filmed it all in like 3 days, like the entire, all the episodes for the season. And there were funny characters, and it was sort of a comedy and a sort of a spooky vampire thing. But they had one of these little vignettes every episode. It was like a mashup of little skits and sketches. But every day they had a physics professor named Professor Julius Sumner Miller. And although he was quite dramatic to look at, and I think he tousled his hair to fit in with the hilarious House of Frightenstein, he was absolutely brilliant at physics. And more than that, he was brilliant at talking about physics. And I don't know, I must have been 10 years old at the time. And I laughed at all the jokes, but I could hardly wait till Professor Julius Sumner Miller had his weekly appearance. I loved it. Here's what I watched as a kid, and it was sort of by accident because I was tuning in for the funny stuff. Take a look.
How do you do, my friends everywhere, ladies and gentlemen, and boys and girls, and children, and men and women, and people? I am Professor Julius Sumner Miller, and physics is my business. And before we go further into these wonderful adventures with nature, a word regarding our modus operandi. Modus operandi. On occasion, in some of these programs already done, and on those I will do further, it is clear that I have used some language now and again of an elevated sort, words like, phrases like, modus operandi and such. And the impression may be got that this is too much for young ones to hear and understand. But I am of the philosophy, having been for 60 years in the academic scene, that my singular purpose is to make everyone reach. And thus their brains are stretched and their emotions moved and their spirit touched. So these things that I have done and we are now doing should have virtue for the youngest and the oldest. As I am given to say, the stuff we do here and we talk about is good for ages 3 to 93, or 2 to 92, or 4 to 94. Indeed, 1-year-olds could enjoy what we are doing. So let's do some more of it.
Well, Julius Sumner Miller was simply a brilliant professor and great communicator, but the granddaddy of the popularizers of science has to go to Richard Feynman, who was actually part of the Manhattan Project. He won a Nobel Prize. This guy was probably one of the greatest minds of the last century. But in addition to being a great scientist, and Feynman said this about experts. Let me quote it so I get it right. He said, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. When someone says science teaches such and such, he is using the word incorrectly. As in, he says you must always have doubt. You must always welcome criticism. That's how we learn."
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make a difference how smart you are, who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong.
Boy, I miss the likes of Julius Sumner Miller and Richard Feynman. We sure could use them now in the place of those giants. Truly great men. We have Scientific American. And again, when I grew up, it was a thoughtful magazine that felt pretty sciencey. When you were reading Scientific American, you knew you were in the serious stuff. It wasn't, I mean, sure, it popularized science, but it was scholarly and rigorous. Well, not so much. Look at what they've gone and done. Scientific American has waded into the U.S. presidential debate, and wouldn't you know it, they have endorsed Kamala Harris, and the reasons why, well, they're most unscientific. Joining us now to talk about it is our friend Marc Morano from ClimateDepot.com. Marc, great to see you again.
Hey, good to see you, Ezra. Thank you.
Mark, I don't know if you, when you were growing up, if you ever encountered some of these science, there were sort of lectures. They were actually at a high level, but they made it so simple that even kids could follow it. I loved that. I looked up to these men because they were pure reason. That is not Scientific American in 2024, is it?
No, in fact, I think a simple way of saying it would be they used to teach you how to think about science, how to view it and how to conduct it. Now they teach you that you have to follow the science, that you can't dissent on the science. And of course, as part of that, for only the second time in their, I think, 179-year history, they are endorsing Kamala Harris for president because, and this is the key reason, she, quote, treats the climate crisis as the emergency it is. And of course, they contrast her with Trump, who has said climate change is a hoax, according to the magazine. So this is decades of government funding, corruption, suppression of speech, and the idea that if you disagree with any scientific claim being made on any topic that disagrees with what any government agency, whether it be NASA or the World Health Organization or the World Meteorological Association, or any government or international body, you are by de facto and by definition wrong and a misinformer, and you should have your ability to express that suppressed. So it's in that spirit that Scientific American is endorsing Kamala Harris because they claim she supports science. She doesn't support science. She supports mandating one scientific view that is not allowed to be questioned. And this is just a sad history of this magazine. If you go back just another 10 years, it was just as bad. Climatologist Judith Curry, who was the darling of the UN climate science crowd, friends with Michael Mann, totally in on the whole global warming agenda. After ClimateGate, she started questioning the science. What did Scientific American do? Feature article, cover article, calling her a heretic of science for daring to challenge the UN climate view. And of course, as a heretic, that's the language of what, Ezra? The language of religion. No more science.
Even the phrase emergency, climate emergency, that's not a very scientific phrase. That suggests a political or moral decision. It is time to panic. This is really serious. That's not science language. I want to, it's fake science. It's politics presenting itself as science. It's like when Fauci himself said, "I am the science. How dare you question me?" Feynman, if he would have seen that, would have said that is every scientist must question you. That's how we learn. And let me just, I've got Feynman on my mind because I'm nostalgic for the era when we could learn these things and you didn't have to be on your guard when you went to school, when you went to a museum, when you went to an art show, that everywhere would be propaganda. Last time I went to the Vancouver Aquarium, one of the best aquariums in Canada, I just couldn't stand, I loved looking at the critters, but I couldn't stand reading any of the plaques. It was all propaganda. Same thing here. I love going to museums, but I can't stand reading their propaganda. Here's Feynman talking about the difference between people who can fake knowledge and people who actually understand something. This is a great little clip of Feynman talking about, do you know the name for that bird? Do you know what that bird is called? Here, watch this wonderful clip. This is what a scientist is.
One Sunday, all the kids were all walking in little parties with their fathers in the woods. Then the next Monday, we were playing in a field. And the kid said to me, "Say, what's that bird? What's the name of it? Do you know the name of that bird?" I says, "I haven't the slightest idea." He said, "Well, it's a brown-throated thrush." He says, "Your father doesn't teach you anything." But my father had already taught me about the names of birds. We walked and he says, "That's a brown-throated thrush." He says, "Know what the name of that bird is? A brown-throated thrush. In German, it's called a Fliegenflügel. In Chinese, it's called a Qinglongtong. In Japanese, a Tohatahara, and so on. And when you know all the names in every language of that bird, you know nothing, but absolutely nothing about the bird. And then we would go on and talk about the pecking and the feathers. So I had learned already that names don't constitute knowledge. It's knowing the name of something. That's caused me a certain trouble since, because I refuse to learn the name of anything. So when someone comes in and says, "You got any explanation for the Fitz-Cronin experiment?" I says, what's that? He says, "You know, that the long lived K meson disintegrates into 2 pies. Oh, yes, now I know. But I never know the names of things. What he forgot to tell me was that knowing the names of things is useful if you want to talk to somebody else. So you tell them what you're talking about.
Yeah, Scientific American doesn't do that kind of critical thinking, acid test thinking, challenging thinking. Can I show you something that I saw online after this endorsement came out? It's someone went through what's called the masthead of Scientific American. That's a fancy way for saying, well, who's the editor? Who's the deputy editor? And they checked, well, what credentials, if any, do these people have? And it was John Carter, PhD, and he starts off with the editor-in-chief of the magazine, Laura Helmuth, who actually does have a PhD. We'll give her credit, although she is much more of an advocate than a scientist. And then they go through pretty much everyone else. Most of them have no science degrees. Like, for example, here's Megan Bartels, senior news reporter, doesn't have any scientific training, just calls herself a science reporter. She's got a master's in journalism. That's not science. Sonia Bata, the chief audience engagement editor. So she's just writing things for clicks. They have the senior graphics editor, Jen Christensen. Well, it's okay that she doesn't have a science degree, I guess. And he goes through every single person on the masthead and says, folks, this ain't a science mag anymore. It's a political campaign that speaks in jargon. That's what it is.
And that's exactly what it is. In fact, you can make the same argument for what we're seeing to our scientific establishment to what the medical journals have become. I mean, during COVID, all they became was consensus enforcement, government enforcement, and whatever the big pharmaceutical funded by Bill Gates and others wanted to say. So they would, if Donald Trump said anything, like the infamous, use bleach, which he never actually said, all of that stuff, they would turn that into, how dare anyone question this? Don't do your own research. You can't question authority. You need to actually trade in fact finding for emotion and give in to this. All of this, from our medical journals to the scientific journals to the Scientific American, it's really accelerated since March of 2020 with COVID, because their whole attitude now is, if we decree something, and we decree, as you said, Anthony Fauci, that we are the science, and we say there's a climate emergency, and we say there's a viral emergency or a pandemic, then there's one scenario that they will allow play out. Everyone's on board, no dissent. That's what the whole World Health Organization pandemic rules are about. The pandemic treaty and the amendments. It's all about no one dissenting. We all have to be on the same page. They don't want another Ron DeSantis in Florida. They don't want another Sweden. They're going to make it so this is global, have global instant lockdowns, global instant vaccine mandates, etc. And this whole Scientific American approach, and that's why it's so historic, with the few times in their history they've ever endorsed a candidate, they're coming out now and they're basically saying, this is who you have to, because she supports science. And right there, that should be a reason to be run like hell, because supporting science in today's world is like Thomas Sowell, the political economist and philosopher, said, when you hear the phrase "the science," it doesn't mean that they're actually going to consult experts and get data-driven views. It means they're consulting experts for political opinions already made, and they need that credential to support the decisions they've already made. And that's what happened, of course, during COVID. That's what's happening during climate. And you have the entire world has gone crazy here. It's almost a power trip, and it's an idea of suppressing any dissent and allowing questioning. That's anti-science, it's anti-democratic, it's anti-free speech. But somehow, particularly the last 8 years, it's all become just the norm. And it's the most, I'm 55 years old. It's the most bizarre thing I've ever encountered in my life, just how the entire once sane, sort of free world has collapsed and been collapsing in the last 10 years, with the acceleration, of course, 4 years ago with the COVID.
It's the news event of the year. Canada's most controversial premier sits down with Canada's most controversial journalist, and everything is on the table. Come watch Ezra Levant one-on-one with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith in front of a live studio audience in Calgary. Nothing's off limits. Nothing's held back. Questions that would make Justin Trudeau invoke martial law. Answers that will make Stephen Guilbeault pee his pants. You're not going to want to miss this one, but you have to be there in person at the Rebel News Live mega conference in Calgary on October the 5th. Tickets are limited, so drop everything and go to rebelnewslive.com right now. Special discounted prices for Patriots and special extra high prices if you're with the CBC. Go to rebelnewslive.com now.